and basically what I wanted to do was kind of dig a little bit deeper to what Lita was saying, and just to go back over these 50 days and just ask the question, what are you learning? And particularly as we go forward, what from this 50 days do you want to take with you?
Okay.
I was thinking of one of is looking at the positives rather than concentrating on negatives, and actually doing things proactive rather than reactive. It's more of a positive attitude than dwelling on a lot of the negatives.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's I find it really interesting, Jerry, that the whole idea or the awareness that you can't work on having less of what you don't want.
Yes. Yeah.
Which
Feels very, very good.
it makes so much sense when you think about it, but you think of so many of our church programs, our social programs, and just, at a very, very fundamental level, Jesus didn't come to give us less death.
Yeah.
And yet, and so many of our social programs, our church programs, are what I call less death programs. We're working really hard at having less of what we don't want, which is...
It kind of brings out the way you look at things. The situation's the same, but if you look at it in a more positive approach, or and to look at what you do want rather than what you don't want.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's Einstein when he said, that problems exist because we keep asking the wrong questions. And the person who had probably the biggest influence on my understanding and all of this thinking was a guy called Steve Andreas. He died last year. Well, actually, it might have been the year before. Gee, time is flying. But he once said that it was easy to detect wrong answers. It's not so easy to detect wrong questions.
Yeah.
We sort of end up going down some blind alleys because we just keep asking the wrong question. And so a big part for me is thinking about the question. When I was talking to a group of clergy, and here's just the simple way that you can change a question and have an incredibly powerful impact. I was working with a priest, or a priest had come to one of my training programs, and he had relatively recently been fired from his church. The church had a big school, and they got into a huge ruckus between the church and the school, and the school went to the bishop, and the bishop basically fired this priest, and the bishop said to the priest, well, you really messed up here, and I don't have any confidence in your ministry, and so I can't put you on any list for other positions in the diocese. So this guy's basically sort of out of a job. It's like, and he would say that he made some mistakes in what he was doing, but I know most of the story, and I think he was right in terms of what he hoped to accomplish with the school. How they got there or didn't get there became the sort of strategy became the argument. But anyway, so he came to one of my training programs, and I talked to him, and then I was doing some coaching with him, and I said, he said, well, I've got this meeting with the bishop next Thursday, and I'm going to ask him why he didn't back me up in the conflict. And I said to him, look, don't even ask that question. Here's what you need to tell the bishop. Say to the bishop, the last since I left the parish, I've taken Rob Voiles' leadership training, and it didn't have to be Rob Voiles. It could have been somebody else's. That's not the important piece. But he'd intentionally done something to develop his skill set. And then to ask the question, what I need to know from you is, what else do I need to do to restore your confidence in me as a priest so you'll put me on lists?
Mm-hmm.
And the bishop thought for a while, and he says, well, I think you have. And within about 2 weeks, he was back on lists. Now, if he had,
That's interesting.
but if he had asked the question,
Yeah. Yep.
you know, why didn't you have my back? Then the bishop has got to justify why he didn't do it and become very defensive, and then likely to get into an argument. And now he's like totally ain't going to be put on any lists or what have you. And actually, that whole process is based on this, the structure of questions. Every question has overt content, but it also has an underlying assumption. And no matter how you answer the overt content, you will always affirm the underlying assumption.
Yeah,
And
I think
this
there's
is why
a lot of the polls are that way. You know, depending on
big time.
who's sponsoring it, they've got it lined up that no matter what you answer is affirming their part.
Can you
Well, and
repeat-
actually, if you
can you
Go ahead,
repeat? Every question has overt content. This is why, and then I got lost.
okay, yeah, so it has overt content and then an underlying assumption. And so and this is why, if you notice, very few politicians, they've been taught this, and so very few politicians will answer a reporter's question, because the underlying assumption that the reporter is asking is, admit you're an idiot, or admit you're at fault, or admit you failed, or admit. And no politician's going to do that. I mean, it's just like, they ain't going to do that. And I can remember, I was only about, maybe 8 or 9. I was very young, and it was just a bunch of kids, and we were talking about, the classic thing was, have you stopped beating your wife?
Yep.
Realizing no matter how you answered that question,
The answer
you
is
had affirmed the assumption that you were a wife beater. I mean, that was just no way out of that. That was, it really, really fascinated me. It was like a no-win situation. You could not win, and it was like, and I can remember thinking, wow, that is really just amazing. It was like, and it was only years later that I actually discovered the mechanism. And you think of, I think it was the scribes or the Pharisees came to Jesus and said, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And the assumption underneath that is, I call that a gotcha question, where it's like, we've got him trapped. No matter what he says, we're going to win. Because if he says, yes, it is lawful, then he's aligning himself with Caesar, and then they can just dismiss him and not be interested in anything he has to say. But if, on the other hand, he says, no, it's not lawful, then they could hand him over to Caesar, because he's basically plotting sedition. So it's no matter what he says in that moment, he's going to underlie that. He's going to affirm the assumption that he's in the wrong. And so that's when he does that, show me a coin, and he has a way of maneuvering himself out of that. But if you look at lots of, you go back to that question with the bishop. If the priest had asked the question, why didn't you back me up? The underlying assumption is that these two people are adversaries, and that would just be affirmed, and that adversarial relationship would get blown out of proportion.
Mhm.
The other one, no matter what the bishop says, as soon as the bishop says, well, I need you to take 2 other courses, it's a done deal. If he goes and takes the 2 other courses, he's going to be back on lists. So it's like no matter what the bishop says at that point, he's agreed to that assumption that he's actually going back on lists. And clearly that happened. And so that's big piece about asking questions. And I think a whole bunch of what I'm really interested in, part of what you're talking about, Jerry, in terms of the positive approaches, we need to keep changing the questions we keep asking. And
Can you
paying
give an
attention to-
example for a church like our church?
Here's one. Every church I know wants to grow. So they'll often sit around and talk about, why aren't we growing?
Been there, done that.
Now, what I've done with churches when they've said, well, when I've been working with them, so, well, we want to grow. And I says, interesting. Why do you want to grow? He says, well, we need more people. Why do you need more people? Well, we need more money.
Yep.
So what you're saying is you need more money. So then the question I would ask, like if it was at St. Peter's, for example, I'd say, that's kind of interesting. How many of you know someone who lives in St. Louis that would gladly join St. Peter's to have a share in its debt? Now, I think that the people over in Kansas City, they may be dumb enough to fall for that, but I'm pretty sure the people in St. Louis are too smart for that one. And then to come back and so I'd say, okay, here's the thing. And this would be a big piece of it, is like, what do you have of value at St. Peter's? And then who do you know needs to know that there's a place in St. Louis where you can access that value? So I'd want to change, because I think growth actually can never be the goal. Growth is actually a byproduct of manifesting a worthwhile purpose. But if you make growth the goal, I think we'll miss it big time. The other thing that is really interesting to me, and this goes back a little bit to what Lita was saying in terms of what goes on in our minds. Think of the idea of church growth. Now, church is an interesting thing. And I don't know how long have you belonged to the church, Lita?
Since 1905. I was 5 years old in kindergarten.
Cool. Okay. How about you, Jerry and Kathy? How long have you been part of the church?
6 years.
6 or 7, whatever it is.
6 years.
6.
Okay. Now here's the interesting thing. When I ask you that question, what pictures did you see in your mind? What did you see, Lita?
Well, I always remember the little building and the beautiful fountain with the angels above it, which I thought was just the most magnificent thing ever. And then many years later, when I was probably 13 or 14 and helped out over in the nursery, it had aged a little, but it still looked beautiful. And then I taught Sunday school probably, this would have been 15 years ago. And I looked at it, and it certainly has aged considerably, but it's still, how beautiful it was.
Now, so here's the interesting thing about that. When you ask people, most people, questions about the church, the word church is typically associated to a building, and particularly if someone grew up in a church. So the first thing they think of is building. So then we talk about church growth. And you'll notice that buildings don't grow. Not in any kind of organic way that we typically, associate with growth. So that language construction, church growth, doesn't evoke images that we can go toward. We don't typically, it's a bigger abstraction to get to the idea of having more people when you use the language church growth, or we've got to grow our church. That doesn't evoke sort of instinctual patterns or ideas of what we might need to do, because we're in the back of our mind, what we're really talking about is a building.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I would say we've been learning during this pandemic is the building isn't that important. The people are.
Yep, that's true.
And I look forward to getting back into the building and being with all the people in the building, don't get me wrong. But I think we are learning that the building is a place where people can congregate, but the building isn't the church. That the people are the church. And, a whole bunch of this conversation about, we need to open the churches. Well, we closed our building, but we didn't close our church. We didn't stop worshiping. We've had to change how we worship. And particularly when I think that, for the first 300 years particularly, and actually down through the history of the church has often not been able to gather for public worship. And yet it survives. It's the people. And so what other things have you learned during this time that you want to make sure you take into the future?
Well, I learned that it's a short time if you consider life expectancy. Our life expectancy.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So if you want to do something, you do it now.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, isn't it? I know I've reflected on my own mortality in the last couple of months in ways that I've not really thought of in the past. I mean, it's always possible, I could have a heart attack, we could get in an accident or what have you, be here and gone, it's kind of, and that's part of life. But going out to the market or something and thinking, I could get an infection, get the infection and be dead in 2 weeks, or something. It's a pretty weird.
It's made us more conscious of our limitations.
I think you're more conscious of people. You see somebody and say, gee, I wonder if they're infected, or I don't want them to come close to them or whatever.
Well, I know, and sort of touching base with old family and old friends, it's like, and I think the other piece of that too, that as I think about it, it's very easy to put stuff off until something happens. So it's like, well, we can't do that, so we have to put it off. And part of, and it would be very easy to say, well, we put that off until the pandemic's over. And there may be some things, obviously, we have to do in that regard, but I think there's also the issue of what are we going to do in the meantime?
You can't
The
just
whole
put everything
idea
on
of-
hold.
Yeah, and it's like, I'll be happy when, and well, what are you going to do in the meantime?
Mhm.
And all of what you're saying there is sort of, I simplify it by saying you look at the positive, but it's a different perspective, sort of looking at things from the other side in a positive light rather than more negative.
Mhm. In these Wednesday classes, I've learned through Lita was talking about it. When you do something with an individual, you kind of vicariously learn something, and that to me is the real meat of these sessions. And from an internal, for myself personally, there were times that I would think of something and actually have tears about it, but it wasn't bad tears. It was we have more time to look at things, and there was a healing that kind of went on. Sometimes it's a matter of time with individuals, and without going into personal details, it was kind of an amazing growth happening.
Cool. That's neat.
And I honestly, we have really, part of what this pandemic does is tell you the things that you don't miss, how you can live without certain things. Like you said, the church has been going on, but some things we do in our busyness of everyday life aren't that important.
In fact, a whole lot, isn't that?
But it's made us look at that. And
Well, when you talk about buildings, the church we went to before closed, we sold the property and the building and all that, but the building needed so much maintenance that was really the cost driver. We didn't have enough people to fix the church building, and so it just, you get snowballed behind that, and you don't know what to do, and you don't have finances, and so we ended up we
found this church.
That's how we got Team St.
We're
Peter's.
new to Episcopalian, but we love it there, and we're used to being involved, and so we wanted to be close, and it worked out really nice.
I think, and I was only there for a couple of weeks before it happened.
Yeah.
I think the piece that I miss is the acoustics in the church when the choir is singing.
Mm-hmm. It's gorgeous.
That space is acoustically very alive. And
it's very spiritual.
and
it's a combination of I guess the acoustics, and also the choir itself is good. The organ and all that stuff is well tuned for the space.
because I noticed there were times when it was like the building was resonating, and it kind of was resonating in my gut. It wasn't just sort of up here. It was something happening quite deep down inside. It was
Good
pretty
vibration.
cool. Yeah, actually, seriously, it was a good vibration.
Yeah.
You'll have to be there when the bagpipes come.
Well, that was actually one of the things we were talking about in terms of doing some kind of outside activity, is maybe getting the bagpipes to come during the summer when we have like a summer evening on the lawn. And
that would be cool.
Have
Especially
the
if it's
bagpipers.
Yeah. It gets hot in the summer. It'll go from rain to 90s.
Yeah. Well, does it rain much in the summer?
No, usually not.
Not as much
Not
as,
really.
no.
No. July, August.
But you will, you still probably get quite a bit of humidity though.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You feel the heat.
September and October are probably I'll say nicest months from a weather standpoint. Spring is pretty with all the flowers and whatever, but September and October, nice temperature and not a lot of rain.
Well, this isn't a lot, unusual.
We had a lot of rain this
You know, the weather changes, you know. We've
Yeah,
been here all
we've
our
been
lives.
we've been having a lot of rain most of the time I've been back, and actually we've had a very wet winter and early part of the year, and we've had a couple of weeks of just really gorgeous weather, and today it was gorgeous. So I think it's warming up enough and getting dry enough that I'll be able to plant my tomatoes this weekend.
Yeah, well, we've been having more rain. A lot of rain.
Any other things that come to your mind in terms of what you want to take with you?
From these lessons, you mean?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I'm all for internal growth. Because the more internal growth you have, the more you can be there for other people.
Cool.
I mean, that's what I mean by it. It's,
Yep. You find that internal freedom.
well, and the other thing that I value is anybody is welcome at this church. And you know how some churches you can't be this or you can't be that, and because they don't think it's Christian. I couldn't be in a church like that. And when we joined, I was concerned about the diversity, but the diversity is growing. And there was diversity, but there's more now, and I like that. It's healthy.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I've been very aware of in the church, and not just at St. Peter's, but it's very true at St. Peter's, but I talked to a lot of clergy across the country, and within the church, particularly within the church, there has been a real sense of graciousness in terms of, I think of, overnight, people had to start streaming their church services, and often with minimal technical awareness. People who could barely turn on a cell phone were streaming to Facebook and YouTube with just cell phones and what have you. And like the very first 2 broadcasts that we did from inside the church were literally done on a cell phone. Jacqueline was there with a cell phone, and across the country you had a bunch of rank amateurs putting together worship services and streaming them, and they were incredibly well received. And I can think, for example, of in days gone by being in parishes where at the end of the service someone would ring me up because there was a typo in the bulletin.
Yes.
And I mean, some of the errors, if you like, if you want to call them that, in terms of the production, you know, technically you could say are worse than a typo in a bulletin, but there was a spirit of graciousness. And actually, and I think even in the society, I think it has eroded in the last couple of weeks, but there was a graciousness in large chunks of society. I noticed, like on our street, people would be out in their yard mowing the lawn or trimming trees and what have you, and you would see them, and even though, I mean, I just moved in and really didn't know anybody, there was a friendliness, a wave, a sort of a connection.
Yes.
And as I say, I think a bunch of that has got eroded in the last couple of weeks, but I think that sense of graciousness is one thing that I've really valued, and hope we can find ways to continue that as a people and as a community. And it's also interesting how, you know, the whole thing about people don't like change. I just think that concept is a nonsense. I think of how much change has been brought upon people, and how, in large part, it has been, been graciously accepted. And I can think of people who basically sort of look at their iPhone and hate it and all this newfangled technology and all of that kind of stuff. And it's like, now, I've got to figure it out. And so that I want to talk to the grandkids, and that's more important than all of those. And so that there's, I think, necessity has caused people to actually develop the skills to make the changes they need to do to be able to continue to access the things that they really value.
I was going to say, I think a lot of people don't like change because there's a fear factor in there of the unknown.
Well, and fear of being ripped off of something that's important, whether it just be predictability, you know, consistency, and all sorts of things that, I mean, I don't want to be ripped off. I don't want to lose something that's of value. And so, and the other thing, though, I think also is when change is inflicted on people and they don't have a say.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That you get a lot of resistance.
Yeah, we weren't around then, but I understand when you changed the prayer book, people didn't like that. When they went to the old prayer book was 1800 something.
Well, actually, there were several. The one that most churches used was the 1928, but there were some people using the 18 something or other missal. But that's an example. I think the prayer book, versions of the Bible, hymnals are another example. Those are all examples of what I call a temporal vehicle being a vehicle of something timeless. And that's why I keep making this distinction between temporal and timeless. You know, when you think of worship, you know, the timeless quality is connection with God. The temporal vehicle may be a particular prayer book or a hymnal or and when you change the vehicle, people weren't feeling connected like they used to. And I think if we'd spent more time helping people become aware of the connection and less focused on the specific words of a prayer book or a specific temporal aspect. So that's been a pretty consistent theme through a lot of the stuff that I've been writing about in the last 50 days, is that distinction between temporal and eternal, or something that's timeless, that's not bound by time. And for me, I don't know whether it's just I'm an old engineer, but the idea of timeless that's an interesting concept to imagine life without time. But I think that's what eternal life is. It's not just the prolongation of time, but it is life that is not bound by time. And that intellectually, that makes a lot of sense to me. Sort of at a subjective level, it's like, that's kind of weird. Sort of, well, I think that's a big piece of resurrection. And you think about Jesus after the resurrection, he was not limited by time. He would suddenly appear and then he'd disappear and appear somewhere else. He also did not physically look the same. It was only when he did something that was timeless that people recognized him. When he called them by name, or he took the bread, when he talked to them. But it was the temporal form of Jesus they did not recognize anymore.
I just thought of something. If you stop by our house sometime, you might not recognize me either. Excuse me. In my old age, I seem to see a lot of humor in just about everything.
That's cool.
Were there things that you hope to drill into our minds when we do this course?
I'm not sure that I'd want to drill anything into anyone's mind. That's a metaphor that I'm too crazy about.
That's my engineer husband.
But I think one of the things that I would like to see, and again, I don't have a prior reference point, so it's like I don't know what it was like before, but I have really deeply appreciated the way the staff has come together, and the creativity, the flexibility and the creativity to think how to do things outside the box. And I hope we can, that would be one thing that I hope we can continue to be
Yes.
doing things that are creative, outside the box, and some of it's just even sort of smaller things on some of the worship that we're doing. Some of the fine tuning to make it's not like we're just simply trying to duplicate Sunday morning in the church, but to provide a service that is not unlike this church service, but is takes into account that the medium has changed. Just as an example, it didn't make any sense to me when I was, say, celebrating the worship and I'd say, "The Lord be with you." And there's kind of like no one saying, "And also with you." Or we could have done something like that, but it would have created a lot more complexity to the work that Jacqueline, for example, would have to do. We do a bit of that, various places, but the whole point of that, "The Lord be with you and also with you," is it's really about a recognition that God is present wherever 2 or 3 people are gathered. Jesus is present, and so instead of doing "The Lord be with you," we have that statement, "The Lord is present. Let us pray." And that, to me, makes more sense for what we're doing on a Sunday morning in our stream service than just sort of slavishly sticking to the prayer book. Because the context that the prayer book was written for isn't what we're currently doing. So, and I think the willingness of the staff to explore that sort of stuff and the creativity, flexibility that I have really valued and appreciated that. And I've also really valued the number of people that have stepped up and offered to be like part of the blessing, part of the peace, doing the reading and other parts of the service. The blessings that we have been using, a colleague or a couple of colleagues, parishioners in my last parish, and I wrote most of them. And we had a little team of, there was one person who was a poet, and the other was kind of like an English major, who could make sure we had the right number of clauses and phrases and verbs that were working together and all of that, because I like playing with words, but I didn't know how to do that. So, but we created most of those prayers and blessings, and they're highly interactive, and I was thinking I really like them, but I don't know how they'll work on the video feed. And I don't know what I have been really moved, particularly by the blessings. And the priest says something and you've got a whole family saying bits of it. Just there's something about that.
Yeah, the church services tonight have really been excellent.
Well, and the people's participation makes it real.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I've got a friend who is in a parish, and they've been allowed to stream from the service, but they only allowed like 2 or 3 people in the church. So they have an organist, possibly a cantor, the priest, and someone running a camera. And there's very, very little participation. And I was sharing one of our services with a person in that congregation, and that was the comment that they had made was, while they like what they're seeing with the service from the church, she'd said, "Wow, you have a lot of participation in your service, which
And that
yeah, I
has to
found.
be invited. That has to be invited by the leadership,
Uh-huh.
the participation, which is very important because that's how you grow spiritually. I mean, to be part of it.
Yeah, and I think those people have become a vital part
Yeah.
of our Sunday morning worship. So,
Well, if you participate, you really feel like you're part of it. It's not like you're just watching a movie or something, you're part of it. And
yep.
And there's a little bit of, well, I wonder who's going to be on today. So you want to watch.
Or it might be you. You never know.
Yeah.
So what's our next Zoom class?
I think what we're going to do, we won't be doing anything next week, but the following week, we may be starting our summer chillin' program, which is going to be more, there won't be sort of formation teaching kind of like this was. It will be more social interaction, fellowship, conversation around all sorts of topics. Possibly there was going to be a trivia night I think they were working on, or some sort of trivia night. Could also be, and I think we'll probably do something like have a big gathering at the beginning and then put people into smaller breakout groups, so that people can make more of those personal connections. So that's, and I think Kelly is looking at another Bible study at a totally different time, because the Friday morning group is going well, but it's pretty early, and unless you want to get up that early, and so that they're looking at another one. So that's what we're looking forward to do during the summer.
Sounds good.
So they're interesting times we live in, aren't they?
Yep. So we some of us are very fortunate to be retired, and so from an income standpoint, it is what it is. And but people that are trying to work and take care of the kids and do whatever, then it's interesting times.
Yeah.
And we don't have to go out. We got to work.
And our first responders of all kinds. I've even, it's amazing talking with the trash men and the people who deliver. They really appreciate when I ask them how they're doing, and they talk a little bit about it, and they sort of bless me and I bless them. It's interesting.
Cool. Yeah, I think of some of the small businesses, particularly in terms of actually even the bigger ones that are very much, like the airlines, car rentals, some of those kinds of businesses that one day were just going along fine and now are really struggling. And those, and particularly some of the small business people who are in those high customer service kinds of industries, I feel for them, because I don't think it's going to be, there's not going to be an overnight fix for this.
Right, you're right.
Like a lot of restaurants, they do a fair amount of carryout, I guess, but still, even if they go at 25% of their capacity, they had a fine margin to start with. So 25% may not be enough.
Well, a lot of businesses are gonna go out of business. Not.
Yeah.
And we'll probably suffer
It'll be,
quite a bit after. I mean, that's just the way it is.
it'll be different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yep.
when you lose things, you appreciate them.
Yeah. Well, it's been good to be with you this last 50 days and to share this time with you. And well, I'm looking forward to what the future has for us all in terms of how we continue to connect and do what we do. And it really has been kind of interesting. You make a plan today and then tomorrow everything's changed. And we got some new getting different guidelines from the CDC and from the diocese, and they continually change as they're finding new data and what's working, what's not. And so but I look forward to being with you and seeing you in the weeks to come.
Well, we can plan ahead and we can change our plans.
Yep, we can.
Flexibility.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, guys, well, you take care. You have a great night.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Good night.
Take care.